Okay, I'm gonna go a little quickly because everyone likes lunch, including me. I do have a lot I want to talk about. Obviously, the slides and presentation will be available afterwards, and I also really love talking about this, so if there's anything that you were like, you went too fast and I didn't quite understand that, like, totally hit me up. Okay, so this is why we worry about all the wrong things. I'm Hilary Stohs Krause. I'm a senior developer and co-owner at 10 Forward Consulting in Madison, Wisconsin, which is a Ruby dev shop. Coding bootcamp grad. Anyone go to boot camp? Yeah. And then just random fun fact, I have a Cinder and Elvish tattoo, which everyone thinks is Hebrew, which just means no one knows Hebrew. They do not look the same. A couple quick disclaimers. So I'm not a therapist, not a scientist. I just find this really interesting and did a lot of research. Speaking of, there are 2 books in particular that were really foundational to this talk that I highly recommend to everyone. So today we are going to talk about some common misplaced fears. What are the implications for your life of having stress and anxiety? Where do fear and anxiety come from? And then finally, what are some strategies that we can use for kind of adapting to make our lives better? Some neuroscientists claim that humans are the most fearful creatures on the planet because of our ability to learn, think, and create fear in our minds. So I think about this as how our imagination is one of our greatest assets, but can also be one of our greatest liabilities. So first, we're going to look at some common misplaced fears. At this point, if anyone is like really not into spiders, I want you to close your eyes, and I will tell you when you can reopen them, okay? Okay. Look at this little cutie, right? I found a cute one. How many people here feel any kind of like fear or anxiety when they think about or encounter a spider? It's about half the room. That's what I'd expect. I think we all know that that's not necessarily like a fear that we need to be focused on in our daily lives, right? What percentage of the more than 40,000 species of spider do we think are poisonous or venomous? So the percentage of spiders. 0.0003%, which means how many total species? 12 globally out of 40,000. So we're very safe when it comes to spiders, and in fact, we're much more likely, at least in the States, to be killed by a cow. I could not find global numbers for this, unfortunately. Try Googling how many cows kill people every year in the world, and it's some good stuff, but not what I needed. But in the US, cows kill an average of 22 people every year, and spiders only kill 7. Right, fear number 2. Oh, I forgot to tell you to open your eyes, but if anyone closed their eyes, you can open them again. Fear number 2, this is a very common one that a lot of people experience anxiety or fear about, which is flying. So who here has any anxiety or stress when they think about getting on a plane? Oh, not as many people as I would have thought, okay. But generally speaking, that's a common one that at least provides a stress response, if not anxiety or fear. But flying is super, super safe, right? And actually the impetus for this talk was I was on a flight that was experiencing really bad turbulence. And like the kind where you're like raising out of your seat and pushing against your seatbelt. And there are people around me who are terrified. Like some people are crying, some people are praying. And I'm the asshole who's sitting there trying not to like giggle because it feels like being on a roller coaster. And I know that airplanes are super safe. I know that we are not gonna die. We're gonna be fine. And so I just think it's kind of fun. But everyone looks at me like I'm just losing my mind. This is how many, like the odds of a flight worldwide resulting in one or more fatalities. 1 in 3.7 million flights. You could take a flight every day for 241 years before getting into a crash, statistically speaking. And in the US, again, it was easier to find statistics for the US, but in the US, commercial airlines from February 2009 to February 2019 had 0 fatalities. So no one died in 10 years flying on commercial flights in the US. And I think you can probably guess where I'm going with this. You're much more likely to be killed by being in a car. But how many of us on our, in our everyday lives feel the same level of fear or anxiety when we're walking down the sidewalk or getting in a car or hopping on our bike. A couple people, because it is scary. Smart. We should all be like that. 1.35 million people are killed on roadways around the world annually. And for context, that's about half of the number of people that they estimated to have died from COVID in 2020. And that's every single year. Your chances of dying in a vehicle in the US are 1 in 107. Yeah. So you're like, great, now I'm afraid of cars and cows, awesome. And really, who cares if spiders make me squeamish and I get nervous on flights, right? What's the big deal? Well, there's a lot of implications for your life, right? There are harmful impacts of having these misplaced fears. And you'll notice that I don't call them irrational, which is a word that sometimes gets thrown around, like, oh, I have an irrational fear of XYZ. Because, and we'll see this in a little bit, the mechanisms by which we experience fear actually have a lot of really sound logic behind them. So I don't think that it's helpful to call fears irrational. So one of the impacts is what's called the risk perception gap. So that's the difference between what we're spending time worrying about and what actually poses a threat. Oops, sorry. This results in wasted emotional, mental, and physical energy. It means we're blindsided by actual threats because our focus is in, sort of the wrong direction. And they can lead to poor decision making. There's a lot of health concerns with having this sort of misplaced fear or anxiety and the stress that accompanies it. Weakened immune system, damage to our hearts, ulcers, decreased fertility, accelerated aging, premature death, impairs the formation of long-term memories. So now you're all having anxiety about having anxiety, right? And then there's also workplace issues. And this is something that I think we don't talk about enough when we're talking about our mental health. When we are in a place where we don't feel like we can make good decisions or we're paralyzed by anxiety or fear, we often self-select out of opportunities, right? I don't know enough to do that, or I'm not good enough for that, or they're all gonna realize I'm a fraud if I do that, I'm just gonna mess it up. You can hold back your team with some of those same ways, like not deciding the right direction to take for some new architecture, or not being able to decide, what the best way to structure a new project is, all these kinds of things. And this I thought was really interesting, is that long-term stress and anxiety actually interrupts the processes that help us act ethically, which makes sense when we think about it, because when you're in that sort of survival mode, you're really narrowly focused on yourself and your needs and what's gonna happen to you and how is something gonna impact you and what are you gonna need to do. And when we're in that mindset, which again is really helpful in certain situations, but when we're in that on a more long-term basis, it's really hard to look at our community or the people around us or think about what is actually the best thing to do versus what is the best thing for me right now. And then that tension between perfect and done, right? If we are spending all of our time thinking about the what ifs, we're never gonna get anything finished, and that's actually the thing that we probably need to worry about, right? So let's start at the beginning. Where do fear and anxiety even come from? So the process in our brains, it starts in our amygdala. And our amygdala is where we process emotions. And so fear is inherently an emotional reaction, first and foremost. The amygdala also starts the process of physical preparation. So releases our stress hormones, fires up our sympathetic nervous system. And that's where, even when we realize something isn't dangerous, like let's say we're walking down the street and someone turns the corner and we also walk into them, right? We have a very physical reaction to that. Our palms might get sweaty, our heart rate increases, you have that adrenaline rush. That all happens. The process for that physical reaction starts immediately. Then we go to the hippocampus, and this is where we store our memory. So this is how we contextualize things that we find frightening, where our brain says, hey, have we seen this before? What happened then? And this is kind of where you notice when if you've been in an accident, maybe so this happened to me, someone came from the right side, ran a stop sign, and I hit them. And for years after that, anytime someone approached the stop sign from the right when I was going straight too quickly, I would have that physical reaction. And that was my brain going to my hippocampus and saying, well, what happened last time someone did this? And I was like, well, we were in a car crash. So it's preparing me for that to happen again. So again, this is a good thing. Sometimes. And then finally, it goes to your prefrontal cortex. So again, it goes first to your emotional part of your brain, then to memories, then to your prefrontal cortex. And this is the part of your brain that is responsible for complex cognitive behavior, for making decisions. So all of this happens before we actually make the decision about the thing that we're finding scary. So it's like our thinking circuitry of our brain, which is also known as like the deliberative brain, is reassuring the emotional or reflexive brain. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more later. So there are three main types of fear. Anticipatory, this is fear of things that might happen. Biological, which is sometimes called innate. So they found that even in 6-month-olds, they have this innate fear of falling. And that's not necessarily something learned, it's a survival instinct that we're born with. And then lived experience. So if in high school you were always bullied by a kid who wore a red jacket, again, your brain is going to associate red jackets with something that you should be afraid of. And then there are things that amplify our fear. So there was actually a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison who did a study and found that there are 3 recurring themes in films that people are most afraid of. And these aren't necessarily surprising, disturbing visual images. Check. Imminent threat. Makes sense. But the third one was lack of control. And this is another one that people have identified as being perhaps one of those innate fears that we have, is a lack of control. Other people can make us more scared. We see this with sort of, the idea of mob mentality. It's also known as emotional or social contagion or cultural cognition. And there are studies that show that this isn't necessarily just social conditioning where we see someone afraid and so we think, oh, we should be afraid. Multiple studies have shown that we can actually detect fear through sweat. Like we can smell other people's fear. So there are physiological components to this. And then finally, fear itself. The scarier you feel, the scarier things will seem. And so we notice this if you're watching a documentary about spiders and there's a breeze in the room, you automatically think like, oh, is there a spider on my neck? Even though you know there's not. Whereas if you were at a barbecue and you felt that same breeze, you probably wouldn't think twice. Similarly, there are specific factors that have been identified that cause us to overestimate risk, and this is really important when we're thinking about how we make decisions. So, catastrophic potential. This could hurt a bunch of people instead of just a few. Familiarity, and this is not in the way that we might think. I think this is kind of named oddly. This is actually something that isn't common knowledge. So if we don't have familiarity with something, we're likely to associate a higher risk with it. If it's something that isn't well understood by experts, that makes us feel like there's a greater risk. And so I think there's a lot of parallels with these overestimation factors of risk and what we think about how some folks are viewing the vaccine during the current pandemic, right? Personal control, if we feel like it's something that we don't have control over, right? That lack of control, that's a factor. Something that can harm us even if we don't voluntarily put ourselves in danger. So the way that we associate risk with like skydiving versus catching a disease while walking down the street. Children. Mention children and panic multiplies, right? Victim identity. If we know someone who is individually affected by this, we're going to have an inflated sense of risk. This is kind of like confirmation bias. It's like, oh, well, I know someone who did this, and so it must be really dangerous. And it's like, well, that was the 1 out of 7 people who died from a spider bite. Like, you're actually fine. And then origin. This, I think, says a lot about us as a species. We overestimate risk for person-made situations than for natural disasters. So we are more scared of ourselves than we are of the world around us, and I think that's just really interesting. So as you can kind of see, our risk assessment process is sort of outdated. It evolved in a natural environment, right? Lion will eat us, bear will attack us. Like, we have to react instantly. And so we have a hard time now in our modern world with assessing the dangers from something concrete versus something abstract. So there's this great quote that I love from Anders Sandberg, who is a computational neuroscientist at the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford University. And he says, the problem is that modern dangers like climate change are incredibly abstract. It's not even clear to us that there's any benefit to being scared. You can't do anything except feel bad about it. By comparison, being scared of a wolf has a reward, surviving. And that makes it worthwhile. vague rewards. So we might know that something could hurt us, but if there's no immediate sense that we can get a reward from it, we underestimate the risk from that situation. So given this, right, how do we overcome this sort of sense of like overestimating risk, underestimating risk, focusing on the wrong things, having that emotional fear response, even if it's not necessarily like if something is scary but not dangerous, which is what I say to my cats a lot when like the vacuum comes out. And I used to say like, oh, you shouldn't be afraid, it's not dangerous, but like there's nothing wrong with him being scared. So like this is not dangerous versus this is not scary. So how do we get to that place of recognizing, okay, this is scary but not dangerous? So the first thing is we can't blame ourselves, right? If we have what we feel like is an outsized reaction to something, and then later our brain is like, oh, that's not scary at all. Sometimes you feel a sense of shame, right? Like, oh, why did I react like that? That wasn't a big deal. Everything was fine. And likewise, if we make a decision and we feel like this was a really good decision and then it turns out horribly, what's one of the first things we do, right? What did I do wrong? Like, what did I miss? Why did I make that decision? Clearly, that was a bad idea. We are uncomfortable with the idea that luck plays a significant role in our lives. So this is from one of those books that I mentioned earlier, Thinking in Bets, which I love. It was, I believe she was a PhD candidate in neuroscience who then became a professional gambler. Just really cool. And really, like what I think one of the key points of her book is that the quality of the outcome does not equal the quality of the decision. So we could make the best decision with the information that we had at the time, and everyone could agree, yes, that is the right decision, 100%, that's gonna work great. No one else would make a different decision, and it could still turn out horrible. And so I think really it's this idea of reframing what success looks like and trying to focus on only what we can control and letting go of what we can't. So how do we do that, right? Easier said than done. So we talked earlier about that reflexive versus deliberative mind, right? Our thinking brain has to reassure our emotional brain when we're feeling stress and anxiety and fear. We make thousands of decisions a day, right? If we deliberated on all of them, we would never get anything done. And there are times when we don't want it to, right? Like if we're in a car and we can see that we're approaching an accident, we want that reflexive brain to take over. Because if our deliberative brain took over, we would sit there and go, okay, so we gotta calculate the trajectory. If I go this angle and then I'll miss the car at this speed, and that would not work. We wouldn't survive. So we have these mechanisms in place for a reason. We need those shortcuts. It's not a matter of willpower, and it's not a matter of just using the analytical part of our brain more. And so again, from Thinking in Bets, she says, the challenge is not to change the way that our brains operate, but to figure out how to work within the limitations of the brains that we already have. One of the best ways to do that is to be prepared. So 63% of Americans worry about natural disasters. 78% see the value in an emergency supply kit. How many people here agree with that? Think it's good to have some supplies on hand? Yeah, I mean, it's common sense, right? Yeah, have supplies. What if the power goes out? Good to have extra water. How many people do you think have actually put together a supply kit? Well, who here has done any work on that? Well, we're programmers, okay? This is not real life. Only a quarter of people have actually done anything. So the key here is that planning is not the same as doing. And I would venture to guess that at least some of us have projects that we've started and never finished. And that's kind of the same thing, right? We're really good at ideas and at planning. We are not so good at execution and actual preparation. Own what you know and you don't know, right? And I think, again, this is something that in our work lives, at least, we're generally pretty good at, right? We Google a lot. We can admit when we don't know something. We figure out the answer. We go to our resources. But we're not necessarily as good at giving ourselves that grace in our personal lives. So every decision, this is again from Thinking in Bets, every decision is a kind of prediction. And every prediction, crucially, involves thinking about two distinct things, what you know and what you don't. And I think a lot of times we tend to focus too far on one or the other. So now we're going to look at some algorithms. I'm going to go through these pretty quickly for the sake of time. But this is from that other book that I liked, so spoilers. These are sort of my favorites that I put out. So real quick, optimal stopping. How do we know when something is good enough? So the threshold rule, the more options you have, the longer you wait for what is best, which makes sense. But it turns out that we often pick too early. So I think about this when I'm looking for a parking spot. It's like, oh, I could take the first spot I see. Statistically speaking, there's probably a better one if I just wait a little bit longer. Flip side of that, as your options dwindle, better than average is probably the best you're gonna get, so take that. Explore, exploit. When do we take a chance on something new versus going with what we know is good? Explore when we have time, exploit when we're ready to cash in. So according to this, our goals should change as we age because we have more information to exploit. Win, stay, lose, shift, otherwise known as shift is better than perfect. Choose an option at random and just do it as long as it works. If it stops working, try something else. So this is kind of the idea if we're having a tough decision deciding which route to take, honestly, just pick one, because it performs reliably better than chance. Last recently used, this was one of my favorite things for this book because it turns out that when I would tell people it's organized chaos, that's real. Junk drawers and piles are one of the most well-designed and efficient structures available. This is for a number of reasons. One, whatever we most recently used, we're most likely to need again. So a pile literally follows that paradigm. And junk drawer is great because our eyes can search much faster than our hands can sort and organize. And then constraint relaxation. This is like taking a large user story and breaking it up in small chunks. So we say, in an ideal world, what would we do? If we didn't have any of these constraints, any of these problems, how would we solve this? Then we slowly add them back in one at a time. Information cascades. This I thought was really interesting. This is about making assumptions for why people are acting in a certain way. So actions are not beliefs. And I think this is really important when it comes to anxiety because we have this tendency to feel like, oh, everyone else must think X because they're doing Y, right? So someone, is giving a talk at RubyConf, they must be super confident, right? They must be an expert in their field. They must feel like they know everything there is to know. And that's obviously not true. But it's easy to get into that kind of pattern in our brain. So this is caused when we misinterpret what others think based on what they do. And the danger here is when we assume someone knows more or better than we do based on their actions, and we ignore doubts or concerns that we have. Cognitive behavioral therapy also has a lot of lessons that are really good for thinking about reframing anxiety or fear. So reframing is a big part of it. This is an opportunity to grow instead of a loss of control. And then being really specific, right? So this kind of goes again to the constraint relaxation. Like, what is the specific thing I'm trying to solve? And then we can add in the complications as we go. So the steps of this, there are 4 steps. The first is to identify, right? So first we have to figure out what is causing me stress? Why am I having trouble making this decision? Where is this anxiety coming from? And then being aware of the different associations we have with that. Recognizing patterns, which is huge. Our brains are very pattern-oriented. And so what are some pieces that are in your life, in your workplace, that are contributing to this, that are patterns you're stuck in that are kind of perpetuating this anxiety? And then finally reshaping, right? Resetting that pattern. And this is really tough, but with practice, it definitely gets easier. And then finally asking for help, right? If you can't make a decision, if you're feeling anxiety about something, if you are afraid of trying something new, or maybe it's something you've done before that had a bad outcome, talking to people really does help, right? So it's using that emotional contagion, that cultural cognition we talked about earlier, but to your advantage. Sharing fear lessens it. It helps us gain new perspective and new information, right? So we can avoid those information cascades where we're making assumptions. Just talk to someone. Why did you make that decision? Why are you doing it this way? And then pulling us out of our bubble. Because again, when it's really hard for us to identify individually when we might be overestimating risk or having those sort of misplaced fears. For all of the reasons that we've already talked about, right? It's inherently an emotional response. And so having folks help us to view it through more of a logical lens or bringing in more additional context just makes a huge difference. And so I'm going to leave you with this, which is essentially that perfect is the enemy of good, right? So if we're willing to accept solutions that are close enough, then even some of the hairiest problems can be tamed with the right techniques. And that's what I have. Thank you for sticking around and through the technical difficulties. I have a bunch of citations. I don't think we have time for questions because everyone wants to go eat, myself included, but I really do love talking about this. So if anyone has like, oh, did you think about this, or questions, I'm on the socials, and you can email me, and you can also just come talk to me because I'm very extroverted. So yeah, thanks.